Hi, everyone. Welcome to Reimagining America, Part 3. If you protest, you may die. If you don't protest, you may die. A Generation Z perspective on political engagement. My name is Renee Edwards, and I'm the Program Director for Fairfax County Public Library. During this presentation, please keep your videos off and your audio muted. Use the chat box for any questions or comments, and we will answer them at the end of our discussion. This program will be recorded and available on the library's website. Please allow me to introduce our series creator and facilitator, Dr. Mark Hopson. Dr. Hopson is the Director of African and African American Studies and Associate Professor of Communication at George Mason University. He is co-editor of the forthcoming book, Reimagining Black Masculinities, Critical Essays on Race, Gender, and Public Space. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Hopson. Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth to everyone. Thank you, Renee Edwards, and thank you to Jessica Hudson, and certainly thank you to Fairfax County Public Library for your support and your action at this crucial time. And thanks to all of you tuning in here today. We appreciate you. I also need to acknowledge and shout out my special guests. We'll hear from them a little later on, but I want to make sure I acknowledge them and let them know how much we appreciate them being in the house today. I want to say thank you to Tatiana Orengo, who is here representing the organization Puede. Also, Abdullah Jamil here is here representing the generations. And then last but not least, Rasheed Parker is here representing Freedom Fighters EC. We'll hear a little from them later on. Now, Reimagining America, discussions on race, justice, and social protests is our attempt to understand and learn from where we are now. As such, our time will be structured in 3 parts. I'll begin with a few words regarding our theme. Next, we'll hear from our panel. And then we will all respond to a few questions from the audience. Now, if you protest, you may die. If you don't protest, you may die is a title credited to my friend and brother, Elmani Viney, a revolutionary educator in the Newark area. Also, the title recognizes the vital work of activist intellectuals like those who join us today, without whom freedom, liberty, and justice would be hollow concepts. Thank you all. I don't judge your strategies. In fact, I admire your commitment. Without you, my own life is at risk. People whom I love are at risk. You remind me of Patrick Henry, the American revolutionary, outspoken and brash. Your work reminds me of Betty Friedan, feminist thinker, author, and organizer. And certainly on this Juneteenth, on this day of remembering the dawn of emancipation from the peculiar institution of American slavery, I am reminded of Crispus Attucks, first man, a Black man, killed in the Boston Massacre. Ironically, his shooter should have faced the death penalty for manslaughter. However, the shooter was released. I'm also reminded of Sojourner Truth, abolitionist and advocate for women's rights. And I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass, abolitionist and author. Additionally, Douglass would have taught us to resist oppressive symbols. We're seeing some of that today. For example, he wouldn't honor 4th of July because it didn't represent freedom for him and millions of enslaved Africans. Today, we see similar acts of resistance against oppressive symbols. I'm also reminded of Ella Baker, civil rights activist, human rights activist, and strategist for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Baker mentored the young people who would carry the civil rights movement. And I'll pause here to say, today's protesters join a rich lineage of people who invested their lives to make this a greater country and make this a greater world. The struggle continues. Now, the death of George Floyd spurred an awakening across the United States and around the globe. The recording of Floyd's final minutes of life and his final words, "I can't breathe," awakened for some a sad reality and reminded some of us of an ongoing narrative, a seemingly endless cycle of violence directed toward Black bodies. It's 2020 and I can't breathe. The words barely escaped George Floyd's lips. It's 2020 and I can't breathe are among the final words of Manuel Ellis of Tacoma, Washington. In 2019, a police camera showed Byron Williams saying, "I can't breathe" at least 17 times after Las Vegas police stopped him for riding a bike without a safety light. In 2014, Eric Garner said, "I can't breathe." And 25-year-old Mackenzie Cochran said, "I can't breathe." And Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland and many others said, "I can't breathe." Well, that's what we're hearing now, and that's what we're here to address. What I want you all to understand mostly, if nothing else, is that what we're seeing today is nothing new. Social movements are vital to the history of America. Social movements are not new. We've seen this before. The question is, what happens without protesters? What happens to us without protest? So what I'd like to do is give you some language to better understand the social movement. I'd like to point out some examples of how the social movement has occurred over the last 100, 200 years. And then I want to draw a comparison to the work of these activist intellectuals that we'll hear from shortly. So keep in mind, protesters create social movements. There's three parts to a social movement. First part is when protesters seek change. The second part is when institutions resist that change. And the third part is what we call agitation. Agitation ensues between the two. Now, what we're noticing with social movements these days is that there are different ways of agitating the system. For example, vertical protests largely accept the institution's values. So vertical protesters work within the institution to change it from the inside, to change it for the better. Conversely, lateral protesters largely dispute the institution's values, and they work to replace the entire institution. And what we're seeing is a bit of competition between both ideologies. In one sense, we are foregrounding this idea of getting out to vote, making it happen in that way. On the other hand, there is an entire movement, I should say, to reform the way in which policing is done in the United States of America. And what we're going to have to do is come to terms with how we can address each approach. How can we respond to each demand? Now think about it this way. There are strategies to protest. Protest includes petition, where one would set out to obtain proof of support for a specific movement by having people sign on. This might include the Declaration of Independence, right? Or the idea of the Justice in Policing Act of 2020. Getting high-profile figures to sign on, getting everyday people to back a movement, and just getting it through the numbers. There's nothing wrong with that. Another strategy for protests includes promulgation. This is the idea of spreading the message and recruiting members via videos, media, popular people and events. We're seeing a lot of that today. There are numerous videos out today with songs and tweets, and especially productions made by young people who are selling this idea of revolution and change. Now, solidification is another example of a strategy to protest. Solidification reinforces messages and group members. This would include the ways in which the 1960s United Farm Workers used theater to spread the message and bring people on board, or the way in which the civil rights movement used songs like We Shall Overcome. Today, we see Black Lives Matter using chants. Again, this is nothing new. Last, there's this idea of polarization as a strategy of protest. Polarization allows us to gain attention by foregrounding specific individuals and issues. In many ways, George Floyd was polarized and became the symbol for why we need to make change in America and indeed around the world. Conversely, on the other hand, we have government officials who are polarized as the bad guy. And so we hear those being used as well to help bring attention to an issue. Now, just in the same way as there are strategies for protests, the institutions use strategies as well. And so what happens with institutions is that sometimes they avoid the issues. When institutions avoid, postpone, and deny demands from protesters, this is completely overlooking the demand for change. Sometimes institutions will adjust to those demands. They'll make small changes in response to demands in a show of goodwill. Sacrificing personnel. This is when institutions remove key individuals associated with oppressive structures. So someone might be fired, someone might lose a job as a way of saying, we hear you, we're going to do something about it. And capitulation is not something we see very often, but this is when the institution totally accepts the goals and the policies set forth by those demanding change. So again, social movements include protesters who demand change, institutions who resist change, and that ensuing struggle. We've seen this all before. We've seen it with the American Revolution, where King George III and the British Parliament sought to control the American colonies. They did this by dictating land use, stationing troops throughout the colonies, troops being law enforcement, and by taxing the colonies through sugar acts and stamp acts. And stamp acts include literally getting a stamp to conduct business in the colonies. Everything you did required the approval of the British Parliament. It required you to get their approval to buy or sell a home, marriage, conduct business, even sell a newspaper. So these were all things done to control the colonies. And keep in mind, the colonies didn't necessarily have representation with Great Britain. The colonists argued no taxation without representation. It was completely odd at that time, but it was an idea that took flight. Patrick Henry would argue the voice of the people is the voice of God, suggesting there was a higher power at work to protest and agitation. And we know these protests became violent. We talked about the Boston Massacre, but there was also a Boston Tea Party where property was destroyed. And in the end, we see the Declaration of Independence was signed. So all of that led to change that we revere now. Should we revere what we're seeing these days from our young protesters? Movements continue. There's also the Abolitionist Movement. We've talked about that this week. We talked about the transatlantic slave trade, which occurred between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. We talked about the fact that this included enslaved humans being treated as property or human cargo, and 3/5 human. Key figures in that movement would include Black and white activists: William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, Sojourner Truth, Nat Turner, John Brown, all taking different approaches, be it vertical or lateral means, to conduct protest and change. All of this would result in the Civil War. Movements continue. The women's rights movement, no stranger to much of what we're seeing today. We know within that movement, there was a suffrage movement. We know the women's rights movement takes on a first, second, and third wave of feminism, different ways of addressing different types of oppression. Recall the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which would be called the first women's suffrage convention in the US, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, also attended by Frederick Douglass. So he would be considered not only an abolitionist, but a suffragist, an early feminist thinker, if you will. And keep in mind, even at that convention, even though there were ideas discussed at how to obtain rights for women, the idea of voting and suffrage was still seen as odd, to the point that many of the attendees didn't want to sign on with it at first. So they came up with this Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, again, a symbol modeled after the Declaration of Independence, which would resolve that woman is man's equal. Without any of this, we might not have a 19th Amendment, where the right to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. It took social protest and social movements to make that happen. And again, the civil rights movement starts with what W.E. Du Bois would assert to be the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. Indeed, Du Bois was correct. In 1955, we saw the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till. This brought attention to lynching and domestic terror against Black Americans. In 55, we saw Montgomery bus boycott. Now, Rosa Parks gets credit for refusing to give up her seat, but we cannot forget 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, who also resisted segregation prior to Rosa Parks. We know that in '63, the March on Washington brought together more than 200,000 people where they would hear MLK's I Have a Dream speech. Later in '63, we know Birmingham, Alabama would undergo a bombing which killed 4 little girls at 16th Street Baptist Church. All of this leads to different ways of thinking about life and reality. As an example, I give you the way in which naming becomes a political act. When Africans are brought to these new shores, their names are taken and they're called slaves to be disempowered. That name would move to colored, to Negro, to African American, to Black, to person of color, etc. All of these are terms meant to bring about a certain sign or certain type of identity. Naming is a political act. We also see that there are arguments about moving from civil rights to human rights. The way in which we term our ideas make all the difference. Are they riots or are they social movements? Social movements don't stop. You've heard of the American Indian movement with the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz Island. You've heard of the gay rights movement, 1969 Stonewall Rebellion. You've heard of the labor rights movement, which included the 1960 Delano Grape strike and boycott. These are not new ideas. Without social protest, without social movement, we don't live the lives that we have now. As an example, I want to show you how Black Lives Matter helps to make a difference. I use a popular image. Some of you may be familiar with 21 Savage. On February 3rd, 2019, 21 Savage was taken into custody by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, after a vehicle was pulled over that contained him, his cousin, and 2 other men. They had been targeted in an operation involving charges of aggravated assault and violation of the Georgia Gang Act. Savage later alleged that he was personally targeted in the operation. After his arrest, ICE revealed that Savage was a British national who had been in the United States unlawfully since his non-immigrant visa expired in July of 2006. Savage's management expressed that he had been trying to get his visa renewed since the year 2017. Now, Savage, who's also known as Shea Ben Abraham Joseph, was detained by ICE until Black Lives Matter got involved. They joined with nearly 60 celebrities, human rights organizations, and everyday people to help bring about change. You see some of the strategies before you, the way in which they use popular people to get involved, to promulgate the idea, the way in which they called on Congressman Hank Johnson to get involved, working within the system, and even going to Staples Center in LA on Grammy Day to bring about attention and to get that petition signed. Shortly thereafter, Savage was released. So what we saw was an effort to examine and bring attention to unfair targeting of Black immigrants and nearly 600,000 undocumented immigrants across the US. Certainly Black Lives Matter has made a difference and continues to make a difference beyond the stereotypes and the way in which we identity freeze these individuals and groups. I say to you, without social protest, we wouldn't have the freedoms we have today. So with that, I'd like to then turn this discussion over to our panel. And what I want to do is bring our panel in. We're going to ask a couple questions regarding their personal response, their personal actions when it comes to some of these issues having to do with civil and human rights. And then we're going to learn more about their organizations. So I think what I'll do is I'll stop the video, I'll pull down the PowerPoint. There's Renee. And what I'll do is ask that you all address the questions if you like, and then offer anything else that you might want to offer. So first things first, I'll start with Rasheed. Rasheed, what was your immediate response to the death of George Floyd? How did it feel? What did you feel? What was your reaction?
Heartbreak. Immediate heartbreak and a feeling of here we go again. Feelings of frustration, feelings of how many times are we going to have to go through this? And I personally felt that our country had no soul. The fact that we were here time and time and time again, and for him to literally plead for his life and nobody did anything to help him. In that moment, I felt like this country had no soul.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna ask Abdullah to respond to the same question. Abdullah, what was your immediate response to the death of George Floyd? How did it make you feel?
First of all, I wanted to say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. This is the way, as a Muslim, we start off our speeches. And in general, we praise God, and then we send our salutation on the Prophet, Allah upon the Messenger. So for me, the state that I was in was actually in like a state of perplexity. I was very troubled at the fact that I felt so normal. I actually got the news in my car, and I saw it on my phone at a red light, and I just didn't have a reaction to it. So it kind of troubled me in the sense that I felt so normal about it. It just keeps on happening again, like Rasheed said. It just keeps on reoccurring. And even the statement, "I can't breathe," how repetitive is that statement? You mentioned all the people that have mentioned this statement. including, like, for example, Shukri Abdi, who was drowned. She couldn't breathe either.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
she couldn't breathe either. And just the fact that it just kept on reoccurring, and it's just like
Mhm.
history is repeating itself again and again. I just felt so
12 years
normal about
old.
it. Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
gonna interrupt you. 12 years old for Shukri.
12 years old, drowned, and you know, justice has not been served yet. You know, so the thing is, I was kind of just troubled in my heart that it felt so normal. I looked at my phone, just kind of put it back down. You know, it was that was the state I was in.
You said something normal. I'm coming back to that.
Mm.
Tatiana,
Yes.
what was the immediate response to the death of George Floyd? How did it make you feel?
I completely agree with Abdullah. Of course, it was the way George Floyd was murdered was just horrific, and so I would love to sit here and say that I'm not desensitized at all, but that's just not true at this point. It's just a continuous pattern of deaths, and one of the worst ones they're all terrible, but that I could remember because we have a certain sensitivity when it comes to children, was Tamir Rice.
Yeah.
And I believe that after that, we all became used to what we're seeing, and we all became complicit in this violence. And there's a long history of state sanctioned violence, and this is not new. And so when I saw that, it was just like, when is this going to be over type reaction.
Wow, interesting. So I'm hearing a couple different responses that I think at some point it might be worth returning to. But the idea of your country having no soul, right? The sheer disappointment in your countrymen and women when it comes to Black, brown bodies, when it comes to social identity being targeted within a cycle of violence. Also, Abdullah's commented on it being normal is shocking to me. It is shocking that we normalize violence. Violence that occurs near us, violence that occurs across the country, but we normalize it as though it's just another random act. That is shocking. That is disturbing. And then Tatiana, you bringing in Tamir Rice, I think that for many of us, certainly death and violence against individuals and groups is a shocking and disappointing event always. But again, you think about it in terms of children, and 12-year-old Tamir Rice, and a kid playing with a gun, much in the same way that he was reared, right? We were taught coming up that you could play cops and robbers or cowboys and all of these different, scenarios that help to socialize children and who they can become and what they can do. And yet he pays the ultimate price for it. So now that you're dealing with it, now that you're experiencing this multitude of feelings, what's next? I mean, you all got involved with organizations, but I'm going to hold off on that. I want to know what you did next in terms of how you responded to opportunities to either protest or to give voice to, or what's next for you? How did you get involved in that overall narrative? I'll start with, if you have something to say, please.
Well, I think that it was a very weird moment of, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and in any other situation, it's like immediately go out. And I think that, at least for me, I got to the point where it's like, there's a danger either way. There's a danger if we stay home because of the pandemic, because people are dying innocently. And then there's a danger if we go out. And so, I mean, immediately, I'm actually from DC, and I'm currently in Tampa and for vacation. I've been here for a couple months now, visiting family, but I'm not connected with the communities here. And immediately I just found protests, and I got involved with the way I could. They have, in Tampa, there has been multiple times where they have used excessive force on protesters, on peaceful protesters. And it definitely has been scary going out. But yeah, I basically got involved in protests, and from there, I continue to organize.
May I ask how your family and friends responded to you going out? Were they completely supportive? Were they afraid for you? Did anybody advise you not to do it?
Yeah, I believe that my family, they knew that I was going as soon as they saw it on the TV what was happening, but they definitely were scared. They saw how violent the police were becoming and what this was turning into, and they were scared for me. But actually, a lot of my family has started to come out to protest and get involved as well. So it's been a positive turnout for that.
All right, all right. So Rasheed, have you attended protests? Where and when?
Yes, sir. Similar to Tatiana, I had a slight combination of immediately feeling like I needed to do something while also feeling hesitant because we are still in a global pandemic and trying to navigate how to be safe around that. But I first went out to protest in DC on May 31st. And that day, particularly, if you're watching the news, was the day when the riots got particularly bad in DC. Buildings were destroyed, fires erupted. I was right there. Pretty much saw it all happen. I saw the AFL-CIO building go into flames. And my immediate response going out there was similar feelings to watching the video of the killing. Was, here we go again. But what I immediately noticed was different this time around was the variety of people that I saw. This wasn't my first time protesting. My first protest I could attribute to the killing of Trayvon Martin. And that protest was primarily, if not entirely, all consisting of Black people. This time around, when I went out on that Sunday, I saw people that looked like me, but also people that didn't look like me, and of all different races and cultures and sexualities and identities. And that was the moment when I realized, oh, this time is different. There's something different going on here.
Wow. You mentioned that you saw some of the activities that tended to get even more violent or even more more dangerous, I'll say.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall any one thing that made you pause? And that can be anything that maybe it was dangerous, but maybe it was something good. You can come back. I think you spoke to it when you talked about the multicultural attendance. I think that is one thing, but I'm just curious to know. We can come back to you if you like. Mm-hmm. We can come back.
Yeah, let me sit on that for a little bit.
All right. Abdullah.
I actually did not attend any protests.
You have not gone, okay.
Yeah, I've not gone. So I was actually hesitant at first to go because I used to be involved in a lot of protests. I wasn't hesitant because of the pandemic. I generally don't think the pandemic is the virus at this point. But I was hesitant because I used to be heavily involved in protests. Like Rasheed said, I was involved with the Trayvon Martin one, the Michael Brown one, and everything, so on and so forth. But I witnessed, in my personal opinion, I didn't see great standing change from the protests. We just constantly felt like we had to keep on protesting every year and every year and every year. So I actually switched more to being a vertical protester in terms of going within the institution and attacking it from there. So I actually did not attend any protests this time around.
All right, excellent. So you've all talked a little bit about your organizational experiences, but I'm wondering if we can go into that a little more. So I'd like you to give us the name of your organization, where it's located, your role. You know, I'll pause. Let me do this. I'll pause. Let's do this. I'm going to invite Renee in quickly. Renee, if you don't mind, come on in. And if you've noticed a question that you think works for where we are now in our discussion, please feel free to share it with our panelists.
I just invited our attendees to post questions for our panel. At this point, we don't have any.
Oh, okay, excellent. Well, once we get one, feel free to let us know. All right, so I'm going back to the question. The name of your organization, where it's located, your role and your organizational goals. I'll start with Tatiana, if you don't mind. The name of your organization, where it's located, your role and your goals.
Sorry. So my organization is called Se Puede. It's actually a part of a coalition here in Tampa. It's under Black Lives Matter Tampa, and they're making a core. And so my organization, Se Puede, I found it with my sister, Lilia. And basically when we started getting involved in protests, we wanted to plan protests. And many people don't know that organizing protests takes a lot of organizing and a lot of organizers. And so we got involved in Black Lives Matter Tampa, and the head of Black Lives Matter Tampa, we started talking about how our communities, Latin communities, brown people and Black people have very similar struggles with depression. And a lot of the struggles we share. But it seems that we are not as united as we can be when it comes to fighting these problems. And so our organization mainly focuses on uniting Black and brown people. Firstly, it gives a space for Afro-Latinos in around the country and in America. A lot of Hispanics are Black, and we tend to kind of go away from that and not claim a race and not understand that our culture comes from African culture. And basically a lot of what we do in our organization is educating while also organizing direct actions. We have together with Black Lives Matter, we have created a team of 4 leaders, and me and my sister are 2 of them, and we have not been working within the institution, but we have been coming up with a list of demands and talking with city council about it and talking with the mayor of Tampa about it. And just like the other cities right now, we're trying to demand defunding. We're trying to get those resources and put them back into the community. We're trying to have a conversation with the community about where those funds and resources should go. And yeah, we're moving forward with, we're actually looking at other cities and kind of taking on what they're doing here, because there's been a lot of changes over this, and we believe that it needs to happen in this city as well.
All right. You know, I want to continue this question for our other panelists, but I also saw another a comment chatted here where someone asked, what do you think about the idea of hashtag defund the police?
Is it for me?
Sure, I'll ask you and then I'll ask the others as well. I think that's a great question. It's one that we have to think about if we are looking to re-envision, reimagine where we're going and what society can look like. Also, you know, I heard a friend of mine say this: we are in a period of reconstruction, meaning, you know, after a civil war, it's time to put things back together. And he's saying that what we've seen now is a way of, you know, trying to put together some of the injustice that we've seen, some of the challenges that we've seen, and a way of kind of looking at creating justice for all. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think about defund the police?
So as we've tackled that topic and talked to city officials and just across the world, I think that we've come to the understanding that systemic racism is real. And I think that we believe that the need for a larger police force is to decrease crime. And if we know about crime, we know that crime derives from lack of resources. And in order to actually decrease crime in the areas that have the highest levels of crime, we have to give them resources. And I know specifically in the city of Tampa, the budget for the police is over $1 million, and they actually are trying to increase that budget. What defunding the police means for us means taking those resources, making sure that they don't add on to that budget, but also taking from the resources that they already have and give it back into the community. Now, we're in the midst of a community forum, planning a community forum, because of course we're in the community, but we also believe that the community knows what is needed in the community. We don't believe in going to give the funds to the mayor for her to allocate where they should go. We believe that the community knows what they need, and they need to be given the resources to allocate that for themselves. And so we believe that those resources need to go back into whether it's schools, education, community programs, financial literacy programs, whatever that may be. We think that's the first step of defunding the police.
Yeah, I completely agree. I agree, and I had like my fair share of this question as well, because I actually have a cousin that's in the Metropolitan Police Department in DC. So, I had my fair share with this question, dealing with it, having to try to understand it. So I agree with the defunding the police and allocating them to places where we need it, especially in education, in the education sector. If you go to places in Southeast DC, and you go from just the elementary school level institutions, you see the disparity between places like Great Falls or places like Herndon and Reston, Ashburn area. You see the huge disparity even between the schoolings. So when people ask where would you allocate the funds, I would completely say in the education sector of our community. I think it's the most important place to allocate the funds, and I think defunding the police would be a great, viable option to do so. Professor Hopson, you're on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute.
All right. So you are suggesting that we look at focusing more on community safety as opposed to policing, Abdullah?
Yes, sir.
Abdullah, also, I know that you do some work in terms of violence prevention or working with young people. Would you suggest that funds be funneled into those efforts as well?
Yeah, 100%. I think we should all as a community be involved more in the juvenile detention centers, especially within our locality, our probation homes, what have you, and really focus and tend to these youth and these teens that are really struggling at the place where they're at when they feel like they're insignificant, peripheral, they feel like they're worthless. I think it's really important that us as a community to get together and allocate our funds and for education towards those kind of projects.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Rasheed, I'm going to ask you the same questions. I assume that you want to respond to the hashtag defund the.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I can do, because that's actually one of the core parts of Freedom Fighters DC. So okay. I'll get some information about Freedom Fighters DC, who we are, and tie that back into the topic of defund the police. So Freedom Fighters DC was formed on May 28th, simply by one of our co-founders sending out a tweet asking who wants to organize. 6 people responded, and then 6 days later, the first action occurred. It was a sit-in at the Capitol. That was my first event attending. I was not a member yet. After attending, I immediately approached and asked to join. And I'm just going to read the Freedom Fighters DC mission statement here. Freedom Fighters DC seeks liberation for all Black people through the eradication of fascism, white supremacy, and racism. We are a collective of like-minded people based in the DC and the surrounding areas, committed to aforementioned sentiments. We were formed in response to the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade, but will continue to serve our community past these horrific moments in time. Black people experience violent oppression under systemic racism in the United States of America and deserve justice. We come together to fight police brutality, racial inequality, and any system that does not promote the true equality and equity of all persons. We believe that the abolition of police and prisons is necessary in order to bring about Black liberation. And so, to tie back into the topic of the defunding the police, we are fully supportive and we believe in defunding the police, but we believe in that as a means to eventually abolishing the police system as we know it. I would like to emphasize that we are not reformists because we do not believe reform works. We have seen reform done time and time again throughout this country, but yet we continue to return to the same issues. And so we believe that until the system is removed completely and replaced with something else, no matter how much reform we do, we'll be back here again. And particularly with defunding the police, we believe in reallocating those funds to things, like was mentioned before, things directly into the community. Like for in DC, we can put funding more into help people experiencing homelessness, funding and more food security in undeserved areas, more things for Black LGBTQIA people in the community, and like was mentioned before, education. And what we are suggesting is that what we understand now as policing is only reactionary, while what we are suggesting is being proactive to prevent crime. Because crime is an issue of poverty and proximity, and ultimately crime just happens because it's poor people trying to survive. And we don't want to continue the criminality involved in people just trying to make ends meet. We want to use funding that is going into the police and use that to better our communities and ultimately decrease crime.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So there are a couple questions out there. What I caught was, first of all, people want to know how to get in touch with you all. So I know that we have some information on our last slide, which we'll pull up, but I just want you all to know that you are gaining interest and followers. So that's a good thing. Also, any one of you can answer this. It came a minute or two ago, but someone wants to know if there are ways of achieving those goals without defunding the police.
No.
Plain and simple, huh?
No. Plain and simple. And we have to look at also the where we are in economics. We are in a recession. That is official. And we are also still borderline close to a depression. And putting funds anywhere else outside of the hardest hit communities is only going to cause the issues to get worse.
So one of our viewers actually agreed by saying that funds need to be diverted more toward education, mental health, and other areas of social life. So it sounds like there's some ways of agreement going on, both vertically and laterally.
I agree with Rasheed and what he said. I don't know if this is coming from a place of privilege, because I'm far less likely to suffer at the hands of police brutality than Rasheed, for example. And when he said that defunding the police all the way leading up to actually abolishing them, that's where I actually don't agree about abolishing the police. I feel like it's unrealistic right now. I feel like that's where I see me being like the liaison between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, as in conforming to the hegemony and working with education and kind of uplifting from that sense. So I like I said, I don't know if it's coming from a place of privilege, because like I said, I'm far less likely to suffer at the hands of police brutality. But unfortunately, we can only reimagine and not reimage. That's the biggest thing. So yeah, so I agree with Rasheed in terms of you can't get anything done without defunding the police. But in terms of the abolishing part is where I disagreed.
Tatiana.
So I wanted to respond to the question in the chat. And the way I see it is, why do police departments need that big of a budget? And why shouldn't we take from it, regardless of where it goes? That's number one. Because if we see that there's a pattern of police abusing their authority, why would we give them more weapons? Why would we give them more powerful ways to hurt people? And it is a way to give back to the community, number one, but it's also a way to hold them accountable. Power needs to be checked. That's why there's a system of checks and balances in this country. So that's number one. My answer to that question is actually another question, and it's, what is the need for the police departments in our local areas, our state police departments? What is the need for their budget to be so large? And especially if it causes a deficit in where the money needs to be in communities. In terms of abolishing police, I think that sometimes we shy away from that thought because we think it's not possible, because it sounds so big. And in reality, abolishing police doesn't mean not having any system in place to respond to calls that need to be responded to. It actually, what it means is replacing the system with something that works better for all people. They are here to protect and serve. They are not protecting, they are not serving. And that's it.
All right, I'm going to pause there and see if, first of all, let you all catch your breath, and then see if Renee has any question to share with our panel.
Along the line of the discussion, there was a question about police departments that are diverse and even led by African American leaders. Should those departments be defunded?
Yes. The issue, so what a lot of people don't understand, and kind of the confusion, you kind of see it with the response of the conservative response and the liberal response, is that the more conservative response is thinking that it's an individual issue. So all we have to do is fix the individuals, and we put more Black people in high places, and then we'll see change. But in reality, it's a systemic issue. And it doesn't matter who you put in charge. When the system is set up in a way, no matter who's there, whether it be Black, white, Asian, we're going to be back here again. And people tend to bring up the idea of training, like better training needs to happen. These police officers are already trained. And to me personally, I don't understand the logic of having to train somebody not to kill me. If somebody has to be trained not to kill me, they shouldn't have the job in the first place. And so reform, when you look at it, is just trying to treat the symptoms. And what we are saying with abolishing the police is that we're trying to treat the disease. I still believe that we should have some form of public safety in place. But the system of policing as we know it does not work. It is not effective.
Can I add on to that?
Please.
Yeah. So basically, what I was saying about the training part, I don't think the police are trained properly. I truly don't think they're trained properly at all in de-escalation techniques, in terms of just in general education. I believe they have no education about African American history or the state that this country was in and is still in. I read somewhere from a Pew Research article. It's actually called Reimagining Policing, and it was written in 2017. And basically, they surveyed officers about their last 12 months of training, and it got to the part where they talked about de-escalation training for the last 12 months for the past year. How much de-escalation training did you get? The 78% of the responders said only 4 hours for a year. Only 4 hours of de-escalation training and how to respond to high tense situations. And then the other thing I read, I forgot which article it was from, but it's James Burke, who's actually one of the chiefs of the National Police Foundation, and he actually specifically talks about Virginia. So the state that we're in, that I'm in right now, he says that to get a barber license or an apprenticeship license, it requires about 4,500 hours of mandated work into getting that license. As for policing, it requires only 600 hours and 300 field hours. So 300 hours when you're actually in the field and getting that training that you need to respond to certain situations. The disparities is absurd, you know? So I think generally the police don't have enough training at all in terms of education nor de-escalation. And that's one of the programs that we're working with right now. It's called Reverse Ride Along. It's called Reverse Ride Along, where we're trying to actually implement seminars and lessons into the police forces nationwide, into the police departments nationwide, and trying to get African Americans professors that are part of the universities to come and teach them about the history of African American rights, the history of policing, things like intergenerational trauma, and so on and so forth. I generally don't think the police receive enough training at all.
Interesting. You all remind me of something that we mentioned earlier, and this idea of the social construction of reality occurring through language. Do you think that there's a difference between using terms like policing versus safety? And does that set us up for different goals? Is that part of what we might consider when we think about reimagining what this might look like in the future?
Yes.
Emphasizing safety as opposed to policing?
Mm-hmm. Because right now, policing, as we currently know it, has a mindset of a warrior mindset. Like they're going to war. Their number one mission is to make it home at night to their wife and kids. And that comes first. And what I would like to see is a shift to public safety and a more focus on being guardians of the community. I do not feel like police are guarding me. I feel like my life is more in danger around a police officer than it is not around a police officer.
So I have a question. How would you, when you're shifting over, who would you give that responsibility of public safety to? Just the people?
I think that depends on each community. I think ultimately because at the end of the day, this is a local issue.
Yeah, exactly. Because George Zimmerman, he was one of the homeowner associates, and he had complete control of, and he obviously had a weapon on him, and he wasn't actually a police officer, So
you see
that's
yeah. Uh-huh. But I do think that ultimately it's up to each city, county, what have you, to town, to decide ultimately for themselves what they would like that to look like. But ultimately, I encourage everyone to really completely reimagine what we understand as public safety. And once we are able to reimagine it, we can build new structures in place. And I kind of want to circle back to what we were saying before about training. Another one of my main issues with training is that training requires more funding. That is what's happening right now with DC and Mayor Bowser. She is trying to give MPD $19 million with the intention of that money going towards training. I still and will remain believing that money would be of better use going directly to the community. And that is that is a lot of the response that we're seeing now, is that people are asking for reform, and reform costs more money. And that more money that's going to be taken to the police is going to be less money being given to communities. And so I think once we restructure our ideas of public safety, that is when we can start looking at how we are training those people that we are putting on the quote unquote front lines in that new system of public safety. But as it is now, it is going to the way I see it is just going to circle us right back to the issue before, because there have been police departments who have done a revamping of training, who have pushed a lot of money into training, but yet the issue remains. Why is that?
Right. May I speak on this?
Please.
All right. So I think that when speaking of law enforcement officers and law enforcement as a system in America, we must have a historical context of where this derives from. So law enforcement go all the way back to American slavery. It's not just so that I do believe that they have too much power. I do believe that the policies need to be rewritten, there needs to be reform, but it's not just like so that this system targets Black and brown people. It doesn't, white people don't have this experience with police officers. So it does involve racism, and it really is much more than just reforming policies. I think that police and law enforcement officers is really the only job that you can just kill on camera and go home the next minute. You go home. You don't get detained. You're murdering people, and it's the only job in America where you can do that and you can go home and be safe until we see, and then we hold them accountable, or we try to. So it's a conversation to be had about if this system has existed in this country for this long and these patterns have persisted for this long. It's a conversation of, do we need something new? And it's a conversation that needs to happen, because it's not just like they're doing something little, they're taking lives. And so how many lives do we continue to take until we have a conversation about something new?
Interesting. So we're hearing discourse involving the idea of increased training, increased information and education. Someone even chatted cameras. But then Tatiana brings us to another point as well. Are we still not dealing with what might be considered an anti-Black sentiment? In other words, are we not getting at the root of what some of the issue might be? And is there a way to train? Is there a way to educate around that issue? I dare say that we really don't have a choice in some regard. We have to continue to try to make it happen, but there's got to be something more done. Someone said, well, police can still kill people, right? So if, as one of our viewers mentioned, if in nursing you're taught to de-escalate, if in other jobs you're taught to de-escalate, why are we having such a difficult time in terms of law enforcement? What can we do to get to the real deal, to the real issues? Rasheed is saying maybe looking or reimagining the way in which community safety occurs. Are there other strategies to be considered? Please.
So the way I see it is that we have to kind of cater to the next generation of youth coming up and start with them, start educating them from the basics on in, and then just keep making sure that the next people that come into office, the next people that go into Congress, if the police are still around, the next people that become police are educated around such matters. That's why I think education is the biggest thing. Malcolm X said education is the passport to the future. And I was reading a book, the one that I was talking to you about by Frantz Fanon, and in The Wretched of the Earth. And basically in the beginning chapters, he talks about how since the colonization was dealt with violence, that means decolonization also has to be dealt with in violence. So it's just going to be a reverse effect. And I think the same way with education. From the beginning, we've just been taught that we haven't been taught African-American rights properly, African-American studies properly. We just had a textbook inside Texas in 2015 in the Patterns of Immigration section that says the transatlantic slave trade, they described them as workers, just mere workers, So I think there's something that needs to be done within the system of our educational institutions and start from there. It might be a long process. It will be a long process, but I think that's the only way to have actually effective, long-standing change is to start with the generation that's to come.
I agree with
Please.
I agree with Abdullah. I think just ultimately, just everything that we're seeing right now in this country. Like, I'm not going to spend a long time listing all the issues we have right now because we all know them. We can turn on the news and see them. I think ultimately all the issues that we're seeing right now come down to just complete and utter failure in our education system.
It's mental imperialism at
Yeah.
its finest, you know.
And I think, I think once we put more value in education and on all fronts, I think that's when we'll start to see some real change in this country.
Now, Rasheed, you mentioned that one of your most memorable moments at the protest was to take note of the multicultural presence, which suggests that George Floyd reached way beyond the Black community, way beyond the Black American community, way beyond our national community. I guess I'm wondering why that is. What about George Floyd made it different for viewers, for people who may just see it as normal any other time? But before you all respond to that, I also want to mention something that I think is important regarding our last couple minutes. We've been going back and forth about education and information being used to make a difference. I think what we're seeing is moving back and forth between kind of this vertical protest or vertical involvement versus the lateral, right? Working within the system or replacing the system. But I want to say this to you all. I am inspired by your generation and that multicultural presence you talked about, because I think the information that we say isn't being taught or that needs to be taught, I think some of us are getting it. I think some of our viewers are seeing it. I think some of us are becoming aware of what we haven't been taught in the past. And so I think what happens is that we become more self-reflexive, more self-aware, and we begin to think about ways that we can become involved in the issues. How can I make a difference? I'm hoping that multicultural presence was a way for these individuals and groups to get involved and to make a difference. Now, what's going to need to happen, though, is that action has to occur. You can't stop at self-reflexivity. You can't stop at being aware of the facts, but action needs to happen. Now, going back to George Floyd and the very popular, the mass involvement, for some reason, more people wanted to take action, more people wanted to get involved. Part of our issue and part of our challenge will be, how do we continue that action at work, at school, you know, out in our communities? It shouldn't take a killing before somebody gives a darn, but how do we continue the work in everyday life? Now, let me go back. What about George Floyd's death made him different from all the others?
So I think there are historical parallel ties to the visibility of what was done to George Floyd with the visibility of what was done to Emmett Till. And what Mamie Till decided what she wanted. She wanted the world to see what they did to her son. And in that time, we've seen other visual representations of Black people being lynched and killed by the police. We've seen Rodney King. We've seen the videos of Philandro Castile. But I think the differences between those and now is firstly of how George Floyd was killed. He wasn't killed by a gunshot or it was like a lot of police killings. It happens. It's a skirmish and it happens quick and it's done. It's over. But the fact that in the video you can watch the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that it took for him to ultimately lose his life. And in that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he was pleading for his life the entire time. I think with previous videos that we've seen with police killings, it just happens and it's over, and then we just kind of have to just accept it as what it is. But with George Floyd, if you can sit and watch a man get killed and plead for his life the whole time and not feel anything, and not that not tug on your heartstrings despite what kind of person he is, then I question your humanity. and I think the visual is what got a lot of people more involved and willing to step in. And I also think that this is all happening now, simply because it's all happening right now. I think we've seen with COVID, I think we've seen firsthand when we sit back and nothing happens.
Right. Can I go next?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Okay. So I think that that's something that personally I've struggled with, and other people that I know have been organizing or have been passionate and working in this fashion have struggled with, which is, what was it, like your question, that took everyone, all the corporations, the news stations even, when to jump on board with this Black Lives Matter movement, when 5 years ago it was like nobody wanted to be associated with it. And the only thing that I really have come up with is the fact that it's a pandemic and that we are all sitting around watching the news every day and waiting for this to be over. And we saw clear as day this death happen. Now, is this different than any other one? I think not. I think that Eric Gardner lost his life because he was also strangled. He couldn't breathe, you know? So I think that something that from this moment is a little hard to deal with is, how do we take these people that from one day to the next join Black Lives Matter, and how do we now educate them on the fact it's not just a guy that's been killed by police, that it's systemic, and that it takes a lot of work to move forward from here. It takes a lot of education to understand how it's systemic, and it's not just something that a police officer can get put away in jail and he's held accountable. A life is already lost, and many lives have already been lost, and these are people's children, and these are people's husbands, and these are people's wives, and it's going to take a lot more. And I am very happy to see many people come together, because that's what we need in order to carry out the Black liberation movement, is for people to come together. But I think people need to come together on one accord, and for that to happen, a lot of education must be involved.
I completely agree. I think the murder was as clear as day. You know, not even anybody from the police can argue it. Not anybody from the autopsies can argue it. This is 8 minutes, like Rasheed said. This is 8 minutes and 46 seconds of this pure, cold-blooded murder, you know, occurring right in front of our faces. And it just sucks that even like some places stoop so low to say, oh, but George Floyd had a criminal record. Even those reputations, they were getting refuted back and forth, you know, when they came with these claims. But like I said, not even the police can justify or try to justify for this death, you know, like as they did with the previous deaths. Like, for example, Michael Brown, they said in the autopsy of Michael Brown that he was actually lunging towards the cop. Somehow they came up with that claim, and they kind of furthered this agenda that Michael Brown was a thug and all that stuff. But I think this was as clear as day. 8 minutes and 46 seconds of this pure cold-blooded murder on camera.
I agree with Tatiana. I think ultimately it was undeniable, and also given where we are in the world with the times, that there aren't any distractions. Talking to non-Black people out on the streets about how they felt about what happened, with with the killing is that there's not really distractions that people can turn to take their minds off of it. Like before, like you could watch about a killing on the news and then go to your Pilates class, but we can't do that. Like now we have no other option but to really look at who we are as a country right in the face. That's what I think as well.
You all are making some really interesting points. I want to say, Angela, I hear you. I hear you on several different points. I wish I could address each and every comment. Couple things that came across in the chat, and I'd like to just address those before I return to you. Number one, somebody asked about the viability of Black Lives Matter. In other words, what will it do? What can it do beyond what it's already doing? So part of the reason why I added the piece about 21 Savage is because I want our viewers to understand that Black Lives Matter is certainly about justice and people not being shot in the streets, but it's also about immigration. It's also about people being able to move about freely. It's also about representation at all levels. Mm-hmm. Policy and action, right? It's about making life better for all. Black Lives Matter is an organization, but it's also an ideology. It's something that we should believe. It's something we want people to believe. And the thing about Black Lives Matter and even some of these fatalities is that we enter into what's considered to be identity politics. There's always a reason why somebody deserved to have certain things happen. And even in Floyd's case, you know, whether or not he was attempting to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. You know, if we're all cut short at our worst mistakes, or if we're all cut short before we're allowed to grow, then there's no hope for any of us. I would say to you all that let's move beyond that and think about ways of seeing the world differently, reimagining the world. We talked about the suffrage movement and women's rights. And just as a reminder, I mentioned this idea of the Declaration of Sentiments. That was actually a written document for what women wanted at that time. Not even going to mention that it didn't necessarily include Black women, but that's another story altogether. Sojourner Truth would challenge us on that sentiment with the idea of ain't I a woman. But even that Declaration of Sentiments was under scrutiny because some of the participants did not want to add the statement about suffrage because it had not happened. They couldn't see it. They couldn't believe it. They didn't think the Declaration would be taken seriously if you added something so outrageous to it. But now that we're looking at it after the fact, we realize it needed to be there, it had to be there, and it helped to make all the difference. So part of what we have to do is reimagine what can be. We have to understand that we can't be limited by the experiences we have. Some of these experiences are very short-sighted. I'm going to pause and see if Renee has a comment or a question, and then I'm going to return to my last question.
Yeah, there was quite a few questions about the police department discussion, and one member asked, do you think things would improve if our police did not carry guns like they do in the UK?
Panelists?
Yeah. Yes, I definitely think that that's among one of the things that is part of reforming or replacing the police departments in America. I think, or the police force. I think that it's unnecessary for a police officer to be armed in every instance in a traffic stop. Like people like Sandra Bland get stopped for something very little, and because the wrong police is armed, loses their life. So, I mean, I'm not exactly sure how to structure moving forward, like if we have community policing or whatever's in the future, which police should be armed. But I definitely think that it should be restricted because it's creating chaos and deaths.
So
I agree.
My answer is a little combination of yes and no. Being an abolitionist, the way I see it is that if we just take away the police officers' guns, they'll kill people another way. George Floyd was not killed by being shot. He was killed by being kneed on the back of his neck. Now, once we remove policing as we know it and replace it with something new, a new system of public safety, then I can say yes, I believe that specifically frontline officers might not always need a gun. I think that might be necessary in some circumstances, but I don't think it's necessary in every circumstance. I think that instead of sending out a police officer sometimes, or not even sometimes, most of the times, we can replace them with a social worker who can do a much better job than a police officer can. And so my answer is a combination of yes and no. As we know it, I don't think that'll work. They'll get killed another way. But in the future, once we can abolish the system of policing as we know it, and we can replace it with something new, then yeah, I would like to see the immediate people who are responding not necessarily have to have guns unless they have to have guns.
Yeah, I agree with both answers. I'm the yes and no, and I agree with Tatiana that's saying that they don't need such weaponry for things like traffic stops or anything like that.
So part of what we're doing now is considering another reality. We may not have all the answers, but we're beginning to think about what could be. That's the first question we ask. What can be? What can we do after this? And I think your generation will contribute to that answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to go first just because I think my time here might be cut short because I have to attend to the Friday prayer at 2:30. So like I said, my main thing is just to focus on education and focus on building the new generation upon education. I think that what we all need to realize that these tyrannical regimes are really scared of people who are educated. They're really fearful of people who are educated. And you know, like we have to keep on applying the pressure to them. They're not allowing African Americans to breathe, so we can't let them breathe either. In terms of trying to talk to state legislatures, trying to talk to our mayors about pushing, like we're running a program at Mason. It's a petition to and Hopson to make African American studies a required course at Mason, so people can understand and become. They can't really empathize, but become more sympathetic to African American plight. And I think what people need to understand and read back on history and how much these tyrannical regimes try to suppress education. You know, in 1933, when Carter G. Woodson wrote the book Miseducation of the Negro, he said that if you can control a man's mind, you don't have to worry about his actions. You know, they understood these concepts. You know, in 1850s to the 1960s, we had literacy tests. That's 110 years of literacy tests to disenfranchise African Americans. In 1926, they started the SAT, very biased SAT system, to the point where in the 1970s, when James Baldwin was at Berkeley, they said they had to lower the SAT standard score so we can allow more African Americans in, or what have you. And then the biggest one was in 1712, as we all know, the William Lynch letter, or the making of the slave. In the last portion, the last half, he talks about education. He talks about how, he says, you know, language is a peculiar institution, and it leads to the heart of the people. So the more the foreigner knows the language, the more he's able to move through levels of society. So they stripped them of the education. They didn't allow them to speak how they wanted to speak, and you know, in turn, he said that this will have a long-standing effect of just being able to control the slave and make the slave. And I also wanted to point out the shirt that I'm wearing right here is the what's going on inside China, inside the Uyghur area of China. The reason why I wore this shirt today was because what's going on here is that 1 million people are inside re-education camps in China, where they're re-educating the Uyghur Muslims, and they're stripping them of their identity and replacing them with a new language, and they're replacing them with a new culture of Han Chinese culture, so they can indoctrinate them and keep hold of them and control them for the future. So I think that through this example and this parallel that I drew is that they are really scared of education. These regimes are really scared of education, and we need to push the next generation to become educated, and we need to educate them. And through that, the next people that will come in office, if there is still police, the next police that will come will be those who are upon education, understanding of what is actually going on and what happened there.
All right. Abdullah, I know you have to go. Can you show us your shirt? We can't see it that well.
Yeah. So it's
you gotta stand up.
So this is the Uyghur my AirPods fell out. This is the Uyghur cause is going on in China right now. Like I said, 1 million people are inside concentration camps, or they call it re-education camps. And as you can see, the hand of the Chinese flag is on the girl that's wearing the Uyghur mask. And basically, like I said, it's It's one of the biggest infringements of human rights that is going on in the world right now, obviously next to Yemen and Syria. I encourage everyone to look into it and read more about it. Ever since 1949, when Mao Zedong took over, they've been having these plans of actually taking away the identity of the Uyghur Muslims. And this is also happening in America. Like I said, this is the first form of identity theft, stripping people away from their identity. Yep.
Thank you. Also, you mentioned something too, the SAT. I challenge our viewers to do some homework on the SAT and look at the person behind it. You get some really interesting information. Thank you so much, Abdullah. I am going to switch to Rasheed and Tatiana. I know that we only have a minute or two left. Do you mind, Renee, if I ask the last question, or did you want to?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So my last question
Have a good day.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, thank you.
Rasheed, regarding current events, regarding current issues, what do you want people to know? Or even better yet, what would you like people to do? As we sign off here, regarding current events and issues, what do you think people should know? Or better yet, what would you like them to do? We got a little bit of that from Abdullah, but what are you thinking?
I think the first thing what people can do is we're gonna keep bringing it up is educate. But educate yourself in a proper way, because some people take education and then they end up believing a bunch of conspiracy theories. So educate, but also challenge what you learn as well. Because we just said educate and just stick to what you learn in school, then, you know, like today's Juneteenth. I did not learn about Juneteenth in school. So when we talk about education, we're talking about educating yourself freely on your own, but educate on with the people that have done the work. There are scholars out there that have been doing this work for a very, very long time, and I believe that it is our duty to pick up the baton where they left off. And so with education, the next thing you do is just use that education. And there's different ways you can do that, whether it be educating others, having conversations, or applying it directly to action. And so that's ultimately what I'm saying is education and action. I believe the way that we're going to move forward is action on absolutely all fronts. Whatever you feel like you need to do to make change, do it. I have no disagreements with if you want to do something different from what I'm doing, as long as you're doing something.
So I think definitely education is a big thing. I want to say that I do think that this George Floyd, it sparked something in the world, and I think that is great. I want to make clear that the other murders prior to this were also clear as day, and that there were many people that did ignore it. And so I think that we need to go back and we need to acknowledge where we were, these people. We need to understand why we should have came forward and acknowledge why we didn't. And I think we need to move forward from there. I think education in school is a big deal, but I think right now is a time for change. And so I think people need to get behind the organizers in their local cities and understand the demands that are being pushed forward and understand why. This is a systemic issue. And in order to understand systemic racism, you have to educate yourself. And instead of kind of pushing abolitionist ideas, we are not a part of a reformist group. We are a part of a Black liberation movement. And that doesn't mean that I'm pushing abolition right now, but that means that is the end goal. And so I do believe that in order to understand abolition, because it's so far out of our everyday like thinking process. I think that we have to become educated on why revolution is necessary. And that starts with understanding where we were and understanding why those lives also mattered and why they were ignored back then. That's all.
All right. I am going to pull up our information so that we can be contacted if need be. And then I'm going to ask Renee if she wants to come on. And I guess I'll just say this last thing as well. Reimagining America, discussions on race, justice, and social protest is our attempt to understand and learn from where we are now, but also challenges us to think about, to reimagine where we could be. And I appreciate our activists, intellectuals, our scholars, our audience. I appreciate Fairfax County Public Library. I appreciate Renee Edwards for getting involved and attempting to meet us where we are. So thank you for taking action. Thank you for taking education, information, and then becoming active with it. Thank you so much. Renee, I turn the mic over to you.
Rasheed, Tatiana, Abdullah, Dr. Hopson, thank you so much for being with us today on Juneteenth. I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us. It always motivates me to hear young people. So please keep going, keep fighting for racial justice. Thank you so much. This is the final program in the library's Reimagining America series, and I'm so happy you were able to join us. It has been a stimulating series of programs, and I hope that they were educational, provided opportunities for self-reflection, and galvanized you to take a stand against racial injustice. Dr. Hopson, thank you for working with the library. You created this series very quickly, and I appreciate the time that you've taken out of your busy schedule to share your experience and your expertise. Thank you so much. All right, thank you everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will have a few more programs around racial injustice coming up in the next few months. I will definitely make sure I email you that information. Thank you. Have a nice rest of the day. Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Juneteenth.
Yes, happy Juneteenth.